Oh, there we go. Oh, yes. Let everybody know it's being recorded. Okay, great. Oh, it's being transcribed too. It doesn't really need transcription, but all right.
Amazing. Wow.
Anyway, welcome everyone. We're going to get started. So we're fortunate to have Richard Jordan join us to talk about clerking. He's going to tell you guys a little bit about his experience clerking and a little bit about the clerkship application and hiring process. So to introduce Richard, he's got a law degree from the University of Kiel in the UK, and he moved to Canada and attended Osgoode to become certified to practice law in Canada. And he articled with the 5 judges of the Ontario Superior Court, the trial court in Hamilton. And following his call to the bar, he was hired by that court as counsel to hire law clerks to work for the court. So I think we were 22 clerks that Richard hired. So he knows both the practical clerkship job, but also what courts are looking for in candidates. And he moved to Halifax and clerked at the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal for a couple of years, and worked for many years as a research lawyer with Stuart McKelvey, and now he's working as a lawyer for the Nova Scotia Health Authority. And his area of practice is to be labor and employment law, and some interest in admin law, which we just found out, which I guess is overlapped in the whole labor
For sure.
labor part. All right, so we're recording. And say Richard's going to tell us a little bit about clerking. So I'll start. Richard, why should students consider doing a clerkship?
So, clerking is, in my opinion, the best job ever. It's usually only ever going to be 1 year of your life, maybe 2 if you're lucky. So I always say to students who are thinking about what they want to do for clerking, like, this is a fantastic opportunity, and try and grasp that opportunity if you can. So nothing I'm going to say today relates to the Supreme Court of Canada clerkships. I'm just talking about clerkships at trial and appellate courts. Elaine obviously can help you with Supreme Court of Canada stuff. So why are clerkships so great? Several reasons. You'll get to work obviously alongside judges who are lawyers at the top of their profession with tremendous minds. Secondly, you're going to be able to assist those judges make difficult decisions, sometimes high profile decisions, sometimes not, but they're always important decisions, obviously, to at least the 2 parties before the court. Thirdly, you'll often get to go into court, and depending on what court you choose and where you work, and then you'll get to see some good advocacy and bad advocacy firsthand, and then you get to go back and talk to the judges about their impressions of the case, about their impressions of the advocacy, about what lawyers should and should not have done. Fourthly, working as a clerk can be very fast-paced. So a judge might adjourn a criminal trial or a civil trial because a legal issue has come up, and you are going to be responsible for helping the judge figure out how to decide that legal issue. So yes, the judge is likely going to go and talk to their experienced colleagues as well, but if you have a half an hour recess to figure it out, they come to you asking you to help them find an answer as to what to do next or what the law says on a certain area, and you've got sort of 30 minutes to do that. So obviously it helps if you've got interest in research and good research skills. And that leads to the 5th reason. Like, it can be a very scary job. You want to help the judge, you want to be seen to be reliable and to provide some good answers. And sometimes you won't be able to find the answer, and that might be because you don't have enough time, or perhaps because the answer just isn't out there. It might be a completely new legal issue. But either way, it's an incredibly rewarding job and a very exciting job, and I can't sort of stress the great things you get from actually going to talk to the judges kind of after they've heard the case and at the end of each day of a trial, and you get to hear the judge's impressions as the case develops. So I think my next question is my role on each court and how the trial court is different from the appellate court. So the role on each court is very similar, to provide high quality legal research on the questions that judges assign to you. But the day-to-day life was very different depending on what I did. So at the Ontario Superior Court in Hamilton in the trial division. I was in court a lot. I was exposed to a broad range of proceedings, so criminal, civil, commercial, family, divisional court, which is administrative appeals and judicial reviews. And so in that setting, I got to watch witnesses on the stand, watch the lawyers pick juries, and then watch with the judge how the jury is reacting to the evidence as it unfolds in front of them. And as I said, then the best part is you then get to go back into the judge's chambers at the end of each day, and you talk to the judge about the evidence, their impressions, and see if there's anything you can do to assist the judge with the cases it's developing. So in the Superior Court, I was able to watch civil and criminal pre-trial conferences. So they're very different to trials. You get to kind of watch a bit of plea bargaining in action in a criminal context, or you get to go back and forth with the judge as he or she shuttles between rooms trying to settle a civil case. So if you're interested in litigating, I would encourage you to think about applying to a trial level court. You will learn a lot about good advocacy and bad advocacy by watching trials rather than watching appeals. So moving to an appellate court, that's very different. So as I said, it's the same as in you're still pumping out high quality research, but if you choose to clerk on an appellate court, your role is very different from a trial court. You're going to spend a lot more time at your desk. An appellate court is all about reading. So you're reading transcripts, you're reading factums, you're reading textbooks, you're reading cases, and you're going to be researching and writing a lot too. And other than a rare occasion where a party might file a fresh evidence application, you're not going to see any witnesses in the Court of Appeal. You'll be watching lawyers just making submissions to a panel of 3 judges and describing where the judge in the court below made an error. You're going to learn to love and loathe the standard of review. So when and how the Court of Appeal can intervene is often the key question, and you have to figure out, or the judges have to figure out with your assistants, what constitutes an error of law, an error of fact, an error of mixed law and fact. And those are skills that are very helpful, because then when you go on to practice and you're drafting notices of appeals for your clients, you know how to draft a notice of appeal, you know, like the language the court wants to use. So the best part for me about working at the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal was the sheer variety of the work. In that court, you have the opportunity to pick the cases you're interested in working on, and you get to do a lot of research into new, emerging, and difficult areas of law, and then talk to the judges about that research. So the work is very challenging, and it can be very difficult, but it also can be very rewarding, especially if the judges agree with your conclusions. So if you're interested in academics or pursuing further study in law, or maybe as kind of you could see yourself maybe considering a Supreme Court of Canada clerkship further down the line, a clerkship at the Court of Appeal might be more the way to go. Obviously, courts of appeal are the highest courts in a province, and are often called upon to determine between 2 different strands of law and how the common law develops in each province. So what should students consider when thinking about what level of court to apply to? So we've talked about the differences a little bit between appellate courts and trial level courts. Whether you want to apply to one or the other, or to both if you're not sure. And then federal courts and provincial courts. You need to reflect a little on your areas of interest. So the federal court is fantastic if you're interested in national security, administrative law. I say that those judges are experts. A lot of the cases before them are judicial reviews, intellectual property, like copyright, trademarks, immigration. The tax court of Canada is obviously great if you're a big fan of tax law, and then kind of the superior courts in the provinces have jurisdiction over pretty much everything else. So if you don't have any idea what you want to do when you are applying to clerk, and I would put myself in that boat 15 years ago, I think you're more likely to stumble across your new favorite area of the Superior Court just because of the broader range of matters that they deal with. But if you know you're interested in national security, if you know you're interested in administrative law, or you know you're interested in tax, then obviously that is going to influence where you want to apply. You need to think about your location. So where do you want to live for a year? Or to put it a little differently, where could you stand to live for a year if it meant clerking? So as I'll get to, the Ontario Superior Court clerkships get an extraordinarily high number of applicants to Toronto, but relatively few applicants to some other places that offer clerkships. So if you could, if you have a link to Sudbury or to Thunder Bay, and you're interested in clerking, then like just on a numbers basis, you have a much better chance of being a clerk than if you apply just to say Toronto. You need to think about the articling requirements for your clerkship. Some clerkships count as the articling requirement in some provinces, some don't. Some courts want you to be a clerk as an articling student. Some courts prefer or require you to be called to the bar before you clerk. So Elaine's Clerkship Guide is a great resource for figuring out that kind of thing, but you need to study that and figure out is being a clerk all I need to do in order to be called to the bar, or will I have to do something else? So once you've kind of made your decision between appellate versus trial, which cities or towns you might want to live in, then you can start doing your research. So I think there's kind of two ways you could go about doing that. First of all, you need to kind of know how the court you're applying to is set up for clerking. So at the federal courts and at the Supreme Court of Canada, you're assigned to one judge. But at trial level courts, you generally work for multiple judges. So in Hamilton, there were 2 law clerks, there were 45 judges, and myself and my co-clerk had 22 or 23 each. So, and then halfway through the year we switched, so we got to work with all the judges over the course of the year. The practice in the courts of appeals varies. So in Nova Scotia, you get to work with all the judges at one time or another because the clerks are assigned to cases rather than to judges. But in Ontario, you're assigned to work directly with 1 or 2 judges for the course of your clerkship. So there's pros and cons to kind of each. You can obviously form a better relationship when you're working exclusively for one judge than you can when you're working for multiple judges. But conversely, on the rare occasion it turns out that you might not like working with your judge after a few weeks, that might make it a very long few months or year. So, and if you're clerking at the federal court and working for one judge, you need to be aware that your judge is going to be circuiting, so they're going to be moving around Canada hearing cases, and so you may not see them as often as you would with other trial, like the provincial Superior Court judges. And some of those judges will circuit too. So in the Toronto region, all the judges sit in Toronto, but in Hamilton, in the Central South region in Ontario, there's 7 or 8 judicial centres, and those judges circuit as well. So they go and sit in other cities and they move the judges around. So it's just good to be aware of kind of what the practice is in terms of the judges. So the second thing I recommend you could do is contact the current law clerks who are in the position that you want to be in and call them up and ask them a little bit about their jobs and their work. There's book that's probably well out of date now called What Color is Your Parachute? And it's kind of figuring out what it is you want to be when you grow up. And the authors of that book talk about doing an informational interview when you gather information about a particular job to try and figure out if that's something you would like. So what I'm talking about here is kind of doing an informational interview with the law clerk. So obviously a law clerk's not going to share anything with you, anything confidential, nor are they going to tell you directly they don't like working for their judge. But you will get through talking to them to pick up a lot of information about what clerking in a certain city or for a certain court is like, or what clerking for a certain justice is like. And then you can weigh whether that's something that you want to do, like how much of their work is administrative law compared to criminal law. Like if you know you want to do criminal law, do you want to go and would it be better for you to be a law clerk in Toronto, or might it be better to be in Brampton, which is next to the Toronto airport, which gets all the cases that arise out of the airport? So those are the kind of things you can find out through those kinds of discussions. So how do you contact current law clerks? Again, repeat, this doesn't apply to the Supreme Court of Canada. You're not allowed to call up their clerks. Some courts have contact information for their clerks on their websites. Most don't. Elaine's booklet, I believe, has a list of clerks who have clerked in different provinces. So you can contact former Dalhousie graduates, and you can contact the person in charge of the clerkship program. So not judges, but the administrator or lawyer within that court who's responsible for the clerkship program, and they generally will put you in touch with current clerks. And one of the advantages of taking that step is the administrator or the lawyer is likely to be among those reviewing the applications when you apply to be a clerk. And if you've shown your interest in clerking by contacting that person ahead of the deadline, you've got your name in the heads of the decision makers who decide who is going to be interviewed or not. So I think it is something that's worth considering. And even if you don't want to call the current clerks, it certainly doesn't hurt to call former graduates of Dalhousie and ask them about their experiences. Lots of people who've clerked are generally very passionate about clerking because it is such a great job, and within the bounds of confidentiality, I'm certain that 99% of them will be happy to share their clerkship experience with you.
Yeah, I'll just interrupt there. The clerks are totally, or former clerks or current clerks are always very keen to talk to other students. So don't ever hesitate. The list is in the clerkship guide, but also, check with me for if you have requests for particular courts. Yep. All right.
So what are the benefits of clerking? I think it gives you a lot of practice to become a better writer and a better researcher. Obviously, if you are impressing judges with both the quality of your writing and your research, you're then likely to be way ahead and make a very good impression on your first employer when you finish your clerkship. For me, I think it really helped me as a person to be able to look at cases objectively. And when you go into practice, it's extremely helpful when you're representing one side to kind of take a step back and try and look at the case objectively and assess the strengths and weaknesses of your case and assess, figure out, is this the case? Is this the side I want to be on? Should I be looking to settle this case? Because it actually, if I was a judge coming at this, how would I be? What would I really think about this case? So I think clerking for me really helps me kind of take a step back and make that assessment. I think clerking definitely sets you up to do anything you want to do. You can continue in academics, you can go into private practice, you can go into government. It's generally seen as a huge positive by future employers that you have clerking experience and you've worked firsthand with judges. So the pros definitely outweigh any cons. So I guess the big con would be that there's no hire back. So with one or two exceptions we don't need to talk about. Like there's clerking is a 1 year or 2 year finite term, and so once you finish clerking, you then have to get a job, and that can be difficult as opposed to like being hired back by a firm and then doing well in your articling year, and then you can be hired back as a first year. But I think, as said, the benefits of clerking and the benefits of having that on your resume, I think most firms, when they see that, are going to know, hey, this person was bright enough and had such an impressive application that a court of appeal wanted to hire them, a trial court wanted to hire them, and so they, when you start applying for jobs, they're going to see that, and you're likely to be interviewed. So moving on to applications. What do I want to see in a cover letter, and how long should a cover letter be? So when I reviewed applications for the Ontario Superior Court, the first thing I looked at was the cover letter. It should never be more than 1 page long. And different rules might apply to the Supreme Court of Canada and CLA for those, but for trial courts and appellate courts, unless the instructions tell you otherwise, definitely no more than a page. So the cover letter tells me a lot about how you write. Is it beautifully written, or is it a real struggle just to get to the end of the cover letter? Are there any errors and typos in your cover letter? And I give this example every year, but it's still a good one. But if you begin your application to the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, I'm writing to apply to be a law clerk at the Ontario Court of Appeal, then I'm going to put your application straight into the garbage, which sounds harsh, and students every year say, you're exaggerating, but no, I'm not. We know, we expect, we encourage students to apply to as many clerkship programs as they can, but if you can't get the name of the court right in the first paragraph of your cover letter, then your attention to detail is not going to be sufficiently good enough to be a clerk. So read and reread those cover letters and make them as crisp as you can. You need to explain in your cover letter why you want to clerk. It is hard to come up with original things to say, but do your best. And if you've participated as a summer student for any of the courts, then definitely point this out. There are some opportunities to do, or there were some opportunities to do some summer terms at Nova Scotia courts. Elaine obviously is a great resource to talk about this. And again, that's another opportunity to get a little taste of what clerking is like and get your name known by the judges of the Nova Scotia courts. So your resume, I think a resume is normally 2 pages. What should it include? When I look at resumes, I'm generally looking at kind of what extracurricular things you've done. So be that in law school, like any awards you've won, any scholarships, any writing you do for law journals, whether you moot or not, whether you work for legal aid. There's a big section on my 1-page form for each student that I used to fill in, and a big section for voluntary and extracurricular activities. And the more that you fill it up, the more that I think you're an interesting person, and that if you can juggle all those commitments with your law school work, you're likely to be able to balance the competing priorities of being a law clerk. And then I'd look at what you do outside law school. So the court is looking for well-rounded people. It just doesn't want people who do nothing except law. So what do you do outside law school to relax? And when you're not hitting the books. And it's often something in your resume like that that I would highlight in an interview with the candidate, and it often ends up being the favorite question we ask a candidate, because it allows people to talk passionately about something that they love doing, and that passion really comes across in the answer. So you can give back to the community in many ways other through law, and it doesn't hurt to emphasize that in your resume. In terms of references, a good reference is someone who knows you. Maybe you did some work for them, maybe you're an integral part of their class. To me, I say this every year, it's probably not the right thing to say, but the references are, to me at least, the least important part of the application. You definitely have to have them, but a lot of reference letters are fairly template-ish. A lot of them follow a template, and so it's really difficult to distinguish between candidates just based on the strength of the reference letters. Obviously, you'll get the occasional one where someone exudes positivity about someone and really it's obvious that they really know someone and really value them. But so get references, try and find references that know you. But I think it's fair to say, at least in terms of getting the interview, that a good that a reference isn't, unless it's bad, and obviously hopefully you're not going to ask somebody for a bad reference, or you're not going to be given a bad reference, but your application is unlikely to stand or fall based on the strength of your references. Clerkships often ask for writing samples. So the best type of writing sample is a paper. It's not a factum. In fact, some courts don't allow you to submit a factum at all, like the Ontario Court of Appeal. You cannot submit a factum you co-wrote, and you shouldn't submit a paper that's longer than the number of pages that's been asked for, or that you haven't closely edited it down to get to the appropriate length that the court is asking for. At Dalhousie, I understand you do a research paper in your first year, which you can likely use at most courts, although maybe not all. But if it's possible, my advice would be to try and make your writing sample a paper. A paper is closer to the type of memo you'd be writing for a judge than a factum. A paper will show me how well you can write, how you structure your work. Do I know where the paper is headed after the introduction? Have you put the signposts around for me in that paper to tell me what you're going to be looking at and where your argument is going to go? Can you do footnotes, or are they a disaster, which comes back again to your attention to detail? So it should be obvious, but if you have a 20-page paper and the writing sample is 15 pages, don't just cut off the end of the last 5 pages and submit the first 15, and you'd be amazed about how many students would do that. Please take the time to rework the paper and turn it into a 15-page paper. If you have a 40-page paper, don't submit an excerpt from the 40-page paper, just a part of your paper. You need to rework the whole thing, and you need to turn it into that 15-page paper. So having talked about the components, like how did I review applications and what was I looking for in a candidate? So I don't know how the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal shortlist candidates. I don't know how many courts do it and the extent to which lawyers or judges are involved. But when I worked for the Ontario Superior Court, I was responsible for shortlisting the candidates that applied, and I will kind of walk through how I did that in the event it helps you at all. I can't speak to whether they use the same process now. It's been 11 years, I guess. And obviously, as I said, I don't know how other courts shortlist candidates, but to the extent this is helpful, it will give you a little flavor of how I approach the task. So, as I said, I was looking for well-rounded people, not people who just excelled in class. The Ontario Superior Court takes a holistic approach. So your grades are important, but each component of your application is important. So other courts may focus more on your grades, but for the Superior Court, I think it's fair to say it was more of a package. So I've described how I look at the cover letter, your resume, your extracurriculars, and your volunteer activities, your references, and the writing sample. and then I would look at grades. So grades are important, but they are not the be all and end all. So there are two things I look at in particular when looking at transcripts. I'd look at what classes you've taken and what grades you've got. And it's really difficult to compare schools to one another because each school has a different grading system, and then schools alter their grading system sometimes year to year, it seems. I'm sure it isn't, but generally I'm looking for A's and B's or whatever their equivalent is. But if you got a mark that's less than a B, that definitely is not fatal. If there is an aberration in your transcript, if there was a term you did badly and there is a reason for it, it doesn't hurt to attach a letter to your transcript to explain that grade. And again, if that's something you're concerned about, I definitely go see Elaine and get her advice on that. So there's no particular classes you need to take in order to be a law clerk. A wide variety is good, but certain classes are more important than others. If you're clerking at a trial level court, lots of judges want to see that you've taken evidence. Administrative law is always a good class to take, regardless of the court you're applying to. So then, having looked at all those components, so cover letter, resume, grades, extracurricular at law school, extracurricular outside law school, and reference letters, I would give a score out of 10, 15, 20, or 25. And then you came up with kind of a total score out of 100. And then I would sort the candidates by region. So in Ontario, at the time, there were 22 positions in 8 regions. Now there are 27 positions in 8 regions in 10 separate locations. So Toronto, Ottawa, Hamilton, Brampton, Newmarket, Oshawa, London, Windsor, Sudbury, Thunder Bay. So almost everyone, as I said, applies to Toronto. And Ottawa is very popular as well. You have to be a very, very strong candidate to get into Toronto or to get an interview in Toronto. So if you imagine there's well into the hundreds of candidates applying, they would interview maybe 25 to 30 candidates in Toronto for 10 positions probably. So as I've indicated at the outset, one of the biggest frustrations in my position was that some candidates would only apply to Toronto or they only applied to Toronto and Ottawa. And it can be challenging to fill the positions in the smaller centres. I know that Toronto and Ottawa are the biggest cities and then the most exciting when you're in your 20s and 30s. But this is a year of your life and the opportunity to be a law clerk. And in many ways, working in the regional centres can be a much better clerking experience than working in the big cities. I think as a general rule, the centres outside of Toronto and Ottawa are a little less fast-paced than those two centres, and I think you likely will get to spend a lot more time with the judges than you would in Toronto and Ottawa. But my advice to you is, if you are considering applying to clerk at the trial court in Ontario, is to apply everywhere. Particularly if you're from one of those cities, if you're from Hamilton, if you're from Thunder Bay, if you're from Sudbury, and you can contemplate going back there for a year, even if your ultimate goal is to end up in Toronto or Ottawa or Vancouver, if you apply there and you make it your first choice, that really does make you stand out. Speaking French isn't required in any of the provinces. I even looked up the New Brunswick Court of Appeal today to see if it's required there. And you have to be able to work in either official language, but they encourage applicants who can work in both. So it's certainly an asset. Obviously, it is New Brunswick, and it is for the federal court and for other courts too. There's certainly several courts, including the Ontario Superior Court, including the Ontario Court of Appeal that hear cases in French. So if you do have French proficiency, then definitely emphasize that in your cover letter. So moving to the interview process. So depending on the court, a student could be interviewed by a panel of 2 or 3 judges, or by a judge by themselves, or by a judge and the lawyer responsible for the clerkship program. So with respect to the interview, the first step obviously is to do your research about where you're interviewing. And by this, I mean, as I said before, talking to other people who have done interviews there, that former law clerks, talking to them about the kinds of questions that are going to be asked. Are they substantive legal questions, or is the interview more about the fit, and the questions maybe slightly easier? Do your research about the court you're applying to. So if you're going to Ontario, you need to know the differences between the levels of courts, you know, the differences between the courts, like the role of the divisional court. You need to know who the Chief Justice is. You should know who the regional senior justice of the region you're applying to is. So find out what you can about the court, find out about the court's jurisdiction. If the court has an annual report, and most courts now publish an annual report. I saw the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal publish one for the first time last year. If the courts have an opening of the court speech, I'd encourage you to read both the annual reports and those speeches to find out. It gives you a real taste of the issues the court is facing at the current time that you are interviewing, or within a few months of your interview date. So try and find out the names of the judges who are interviewing you, if you can, and try to read any recent decisions they may have written. You may get to meet current law clerks as part of the interview process. Of course, if you follow my advice from earlier, you may have already chatted with them on the phone or online, so it would be more of a reconnection rather than an initial connection. But then, as I said, when the judges go and ask the current clerks about their experience, about their impressions of the candidates, it's likely to come up that, oh yes, well, I've already met Matthew because I spoke to Matthew 4 weeks ago when he was considering applying, and that obviously shows great initiative and will leave a good impression with the law clerk, and which will reflect onto the judges. You should always have a Supreme Court of Canada decision and a decision from the court you're interviewing for in your back pocket that you can talk about knowledgeably if you're asked. So the Ontario Court of Appeal now asks students to choose one of 2 or 3 cases that were decided in the previous year and to come ready to discuss the case. And then you arrive, and sometimes it turns out you're discussing the case with one or more of the judges who delivered the decision. And sometimes even the judge who did the majority decision and the judge who authored the dissenting judge's decision. So you have to be prepared to tell one of them that they're wrong. So that can be fun. Come prepared with the answers to questions you know will be asked. So you know you're going to be asked why you want to clerk here. Definitely tell the truth if you're asked if you've applied to clerk elsewhere. As I said, the judges expect you to apply widely and broadly, so you're not going to be marked down for saying yes, you've also applied to clerk in Alberta or British Columbia if you're applying to Ontario. Be prepared to tell us what your favorite classes are in law school and why. Be prepared to talk about what you might want to do after you clerk. If you don't know, that's fine, but you can't just say, I don't know. So you could maybe reflect on whether you think you might want to litigate, or whether you want to be more of a solicitor, or whether you want to go back to school or work in policy and not in law at all. There's no kind of right or wrong answers, but it's a question that comes up a lot. So the judges are interested in kind of where you think your career might be going. Ask intelligent questions at the end. So be prepared. The judge is likely going to start the interview by telling you a bit about the clerkship program in that location. So if your question is logistical in nature, like where your office is, whether you can work from home, that kind of thing, it could be answered before you even get a chance to ask. The question I always like to ask judges is, do you remember who was your best law clerk in the last 10 years? And what was it that made them so good? And you'd be amazed that most judges will tell you who. They might not give you the name, but they'll say, yes, I remember it was so-and-so, and this is why they were so good. And they will wax lyrical for 2 or 3 minutes. Don't ask any questions to which you can find the answer on the court's website, like your salary, your benefits, that kind of thing. Take the opportunity you have with the interview panel to ask intelligent questions. After the interviews, by the time you've finished interviewing, you should know your kind of preferences between courts, like where you want to clerk, and you should have kind of a ranking in your head. At some point, you might receive an offer, which is great. That's what you've been working towards. So if it's Chief Justice Wagner asking you to clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada, you likely don't have much of a decision to make. But if you're trying to decide between the Superior Court and the Federal Court, or the Court of Appeal and the Superior Court, I really encourage you not to accept the job offer on the spot unless it's your first choice clerkship calling and you absolutely know with no hesitation that you want the job. It is perfectly okay to ask for 24 hours to talk to your spouse, your significant other, your family, your friends before giving an answer. And it's a really good practice to consider doing that for the following reasons. All the courts now are on different timelines for clerkship programs. Some courts hire 12 months out, some hire in the fall, but most still hire in the spring, and they're hiring 18 months out. So you would interview perhaps in the spring of 2025 for a position that starts in August of 2026. So what I'm about to say just really applies to those that are hiring in the spring, because that's when the majority of offers do go out for clerkships. So there is an agreement in place that's still largely followed, to my knowledge, that no court makes any offers till the Supreme Court of Canada has made its offers and until those have all been accepted. And for obvious reasons, you can imagine how awkward it would be for a student if they'd accept an offer from one court and then Chief Justice Wagner called and asked if he or she wanted a job. So don't be intimidated by taking a job on the spot. Saying you need 24 hours to decide before you move from Halifax to Vancouver or Halifax to Sudbury is very reasonable. And in that 24 hours, as well as talking to your friends and family about whether that is the move you want to make, if the court that's offered you a job isn't your first choice, it's worth telephoning the court or courts that are higher on your list to tell them you've received an offer from one court, that you have 24 hours to decide whether to accept the offer or not, but to stress that you really, really want to work at your first choice, and ask them whether they can tell you if you're likely to receive an offer or not. And you do this because the worst that can happen is that court responds they're not going to offer you a position. But you do it because you don't know what timeline each court is working for. So as an example, when I was there, the Ontario Superior Court doesn't make any offers to any students until all the interviews for every region are over. And there's 8 regions, and we start interviewing the second last week of February, and we usually finish the first week of April. So even if you absolutely starred in an interview in Toronto in the last week of February, and you're number 1 on the Superior Court's list for clerkships for Toronto, you won't know about it until the first week of April. But if you called me and said, oh, I've received an offer from another court, I can tell you whether you will be receiving an offer, even if I don't make it until after the Supreme Court of Canada's made their offers and after the Superior Court's done all the interviews for every region. So my concern in saying this is, like, students are often so excited to receive a job offer, especially if it's a judge offering them the job, that they accept the offer on the spot. And this is something I witnessed several times when I was offering clerks jobs or students jobs. They're then disappointed when another court rings them to offer them a job a few days or weeks later, a court they'd rather have clerked at, but they've already accepted an offer from another court, so they can't do a U-turn. So don't assume you're not going to get an offer from another court just because you haven't heard anything. You need to call and ask, unless you know it's your first choice and you're happy to accept it. You don't know what timeline each court is on, and so the only way of finding that out is to ask. So those are my kind of prepared notes, but I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for that. You kind of touched a little bit on the difference between the federal, like the Court of Appeal and the lower level courts. But I was wondering if you had any advice for when writing a cover letter, if we are applying or planning to apply to both like a trial level and an appellate court, how to make sure that, you know, we basically how to highlight those different, that we understand the different aspects. Yeah, and any advice for making that understanding distinct or showing our interest in the two kind of formats.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I think if you take my advice and you speak to the current and former clerks at each of those courts who have kind of worked there, and certainly after the clerk is long gone, like if it's a graduate, you can ask those questions to the former graduate, like, what do you remember what you put in your cover letter? What do you think? But just talking to them gets to assist in, you will get ideas from talking to 2 or 3 different people about what it is, what the court likes, and what kind of what the courts are looking for in candidates, I think, a little bit. And I think for trial courts, at least, like it's really important to stress the going into court, and watching that advocacy firsthand. But the reason you have to know your court is if you write a letter to the Toronto judges and talk about how much you want to go into the courts and watch things, that might not play quite as well as in another center, because in Toronto you have 11 or 12 judges, and to be frank, you're going to be so busy that you might not go into court as much as you would in another center. So the Toronto judges might not want to hear about how much you're excited to go into the courtroom. So I think it is important to kind of, as I said, know your court and know your audience. And the only way you can kind of do that is to use Elaine's expertise and to talk to the former graduates. But also, if if you're not sure what you want to do, if you know you want to litigate, then talk about how much you're interested in litigating and watching that advocacy in the trial courts. And if you're not sure you want to litigate, you can stress something else to the Court of Appeal. You can stress that you're still considering moving into academics, for example. I'm not saying lie to one court and you've got to be somewhat consistent in what you say, but I think there are different aspects of your personality or different aspects you can highlight depending on where you're applying, and I think talking to former graduates may help you kind of frame those up for the court in your cover letter. I don't know if Elaine has any good tips. It's a really good question. I think it's hard. Yeah, it
is. But I think there are ways. Like there's a couple of courts where you want, like the Federal Court of Appeal and the BC courts, upper lower, that there's one application. So if you want to do both, then you need to tell them you want to do both. And I think you can focus on why you want to clerk overall. But I mean, I'm happy to talk to anybody about this. It can be subtle. It depends on what skills you bring, what your interests are, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think the courts get too hung up on that, unless you say you apply to both. If you said to the BC courts that I want to do Court of Appeal, well, then they're only going to look at you for that, right?
Right.
But I can talk about that with students. We have a question from Liam.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see that. When looking at grades, did you weigh which grade was received for which class, the focus per class, or was this the overall GPA and the class and the type of classes taken?
I'd say it's more the second. Like I think it's the overall. So as I said, I was focusing on, like, I just kind of scan the transcript and look at, like, I'm looking for A's and B's, and if it's like mostly C's and D's, then that's one thing. But if it's A's and B's, but then I'm kind of looking at kind of the overall, and I'll look to make sure they've taken if the court is, and different regions have different preferences, but if the court's really keen that you've done administrative law, then I will make sure you've done administrative law. And obviously at Dow, that's a mandatory course, so everybody's done it. So no, it's not. Sorry, I get that wrong. I get that wrong every year.
Yeah. Neither admin or evidence are mandatory, okay. But they're very important for clerking.
Right. Okay. So, but yes, I'd say more the second than the first. I'm not really, as I said, I'm really just scanning the grades to make sure it's not mainly D's and E's and poorer grades. But I'm more interested in kind of overall, unless there's like an aberration.
And it is good if there's an aberration to put a note on the transcript. You don't need to put it in your cover letter, but on the transcript.
Nope, definitely not.
All right, now Liam says thank you. All right, we're getting close. I know you guys have to run off to class probably. So any other questions? Well, we have Richard here. See any hands going up? All right, well, thank you very much, Richard. I really appreciate taking the time. Richard does this for us. Oh, I got Anna here. Or maybe she's saying thank you. Nope. Yes. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this. It really is helpful for our students and helpful for me. So
great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.